Some started to worship Deathless. Others began to protest the notion of living under the restrictions of what they saw.
Welcome out to part 3, where I'm going to talk about, well, I hesitate to use this word, but best of the 3? You know what? No. It's just the least awful of the 3, as it's not very good either. Anyway, this is Robotica, also known as Daedalus in some parts, and it wasn't until I started this up that I realized it was made by Micronet, the guys who made Heavy Nova. It was also published by Acclaim, the guys who published Rise of the Robots. So we're already starting off on a good foot. The entirety of the plot is explained in the minute-and-a-half opening cutscene. Essentially, the human race put up a satellite into orbit, and by doing that, it created world peace for some reason. But now people are going crazy and fearing it, so you're going to go in and blow it up. That's it. And it will never, ever develop into anything past that. There are a few cutscenes in between, but they don't ever convey anything. There's no development, there's no actual story beyond that. It's really just there, more or less, I imagine, to cover loading. Anyway, Robotica is a first-person shooter in space with robots. How can you mess that up? Micronet and Acclaim found a way. If you can't tell already, the draw distance in this game is about 2 feet in front of you. And that's on a good day. And that's not even a joke. There are levels where they actually justify the draw distance by cutting the power, so you can only see about half a foot in front of you. I only assume they do this so that you're kind of grateful when you turn the lights back on, you can see slightly further. And even then, honestly, sometimes when it happened, I had trouble figuring out if the lights were still on or not. Now your mech pod thing controls really, really sluggishly. The directional pad will move you forward and back, and left and right will turn you. Which means if you want to strafe, that's on the L and R buttons, which already makes it fairly awkward. On top of that, you have your basic weapon attack button, which also doubles with your activate button for turning on switches or whatever, as well as a boost button, which I can only assume they added just so that you can move slightly more than a snail in molasses. What's actually kind of neat about this, though, is you have a special piece of equipment that you can cycle. Stuff like a bomb or a shield, the ability to hover so that you can dodge floor traps or even recover your shield if you've been damaged. This is neat, except that it felt like no one did any testing on the energy input to output ratio, because for use on most things, you can get 1 or 2 uses out before you deplete a full bar, so the only thing that's really useful is the shield recovery. Because when you use that, it's typically 1 shield back for every 2 energy, so it feels like a fair use rather than getting to use a shield for a couple seconds and losing half your health, or hovering over 1 floor tile because it might hurt you and losing all your energy when you could simply take the damage and then recover it, and at a fraction of the cost. It really feels like no one actually bothered to test that or check on it, and that's kind of a problem. So Robotica is a 30-floor randomly generated maze, and while that's not inherently problematic, it does hurt the flow of the game, because you'll never get guaranteed drops of items or weapons along the way like you would in another first-person shooter. On the fortunate side, you have all your weapons on you at once. Unfortunately, there's only 4, if you include your punching ability, and none of them feel terribly effective. In addition to that, none of the weapons actually show any different models. Your character model for your weapon will always remain constant. I mean, it's a little thing, but in other FPSs like Doom or whatever, when you swap a weapon, it just changes the look of your HUD ever so slightly, but it breaks the monotony up a little bit by changing things up a little bit. Also, it visually tells you what you have equipped, whereas in Robotica, all you have is a tiny prompt on your HUD. Which leads me to another problem I have with this game. The HUD is full of useless information. You have your, whatever your active special ability is, you have your health, you have your weapon, and you have a map when you activate it by finding it. But there's all these readouts that really have no point in being there, aside from just making it look more sci-fi-y. In doing so, it just clutters the UI, and it makes it harder to see anything. If it's not relevant information, you shouldn't clutter the screen. And this information isn't even really information, it's just there to make your UI feel a little more bulky. So random generation has another additional problem. And it might just be that they didn't nail down the algorithm or anything, but while recording this, I found myself on a level that does not contain an exit, thus forcing me to essentially kill myself and get pushed back 3 floors in order to get back to where I was. That's awesome. For most points in this game, the objective is to run around this randomly generated maze, killing enemies, and finding a tiny little green keycard on the ground. Once you pick up this keycard, you have to find the exit door, and then you move on to the next level. However, there are a few levels that are preset which require you to destroy generators. I believe there's 3 in total. I believe that was used to break up the monotony, but it just comes way too late and honestly isn't all that interesting. There's no weapon variation, which really hurts it as a first-person shooter. In a lot of games you try and swap out weapons to find what works best for you in what situation, but all the weapons feel the same. There's no difference in their weapon model, there's no difference in the ability to destroy things. Everything just feels the same. Now it's kind of neat that there are upgrades to these weapons that you can pick up when they drop from certain enemies, but unfortunately these upgrades actually make the weapon less useful. In the case of the Vulcan gun, when you might normally fire 1 shot every time you pull the trigger, pulling it once will shoot out 7 or 8 shots, all while effectively draining the ammo, and while picking up an upgrade increases your capacity, it doesn't refill the difference. Now it doesn't sound like all that much of a problem, but unlike other FPS games, in Robotica you're not guaranteed ammo drops from defeating enemies. In addition to that, enemies are not set because this is random generation. Enemies will spawn behind you all the time, sometimes they'll spawn on top of you, and they don't necessarily drop items. So it's almost punishing to go out and shoot the robots, you know, the entire reason you're here. It feels more like just shoot the guys you have to, find the key and get out, because you're wasting ammo that you're not going to get back, because they're not going to drop it. And if the shooting of the robots isn't fun, and the fact that you're not incentivized to kill them in any way, shape, or form isn't there really doesn't feel like there's any point to any of the gameplay. Killing enemies is also not satisfying. When you blow one up, they explode, but it's very easy to miss them, and they disappear. They don't litter the floor covered in blood or anything, as they would in something like Doom, which worked twofold. First of all, it marked where you'd been, and it was sort of a reward for taking out whatever got in your way, because you got that satisfying explosion of gore. So this game actually kind of punishes you for actually going out of your way to fight things. That's kind of a really big problem. On top of this, enemies don't have to put up with the poor draw distance that you do. So they can shoot at you from the darkness and you'll never know where they are. They can also shoot you in the hallways and through certain doors, and because your robot is so big, you won't be able to dodge them. The soundtrack is pretty generic and lackluster. There's really nothing of value here. They do change the soundtrack up every once in a while, but none of it's terribly well made, or interesting, or memorable, or catchy. None of it really lends itself to the aesthetic of the game, or the action, which is another missed opportunity. The enemy variety is actually pretty impressive. Every couple of levels you'll see a new type of enemy. And that's rather cool, but there's really no point in going on to see them. Aside from the random generation, there really isn't too much replayability with Robotica. You've got 4 weapons, none of which are terribly fun. You've got enemies that are fairly stupid, some of which kamikaze into you, that don't make combat satisfying in any way, shape, or form. The soundtrack's a lost cause. The draw distance is some of the worst I have ever seen. And honestly, there's just nothing enjoyable to make you want to come back unless you're some weird Robotica fan, in which case I have my doubts you even exist. Honestly, Robotica isn't all that good. I mean, I think it's a compliment to say it's average. It's 30 levels of monotony with 4 weapons that really don't make fighting enemies worthwhile. Enemies that will spawn on top of you, killing you instantly in some cases. All with no incentive to even go out of your way to fight them, thus kind of defeating the entire purpose of the action. I think at this point in my life, when I played Robotica, I had just gotten so fed up with all the crappy robot games that, while this game is not good in any way, shape, or form, I really just hate it for what it is, simply because it's a robot game. And honestly, by this point, I didn't want to ever play one ever again. That was until I found this one game. This one glorious game, of which there is no comparison. There is no match. This one game that, well, I wouldn't say redeems it, because honestly nothing ever redeems Heavy Nova. It's the best robot game I've ever played. And that game is